Yeah, I'm very thankful to be here. I'm very thankful for having been invited. I happen to know Andrew since I think something like 2 years when he initiated all this work. And to start with this, I just took some notes when Andrew was talking. I think it's very important to stress this because I had the same sensation. When you said, Andrew, my world has shifted and you had been concentrating on other regions of the world, but then basically you shifted around and learned that there's something happening in the Western Hemisphere about media and consent. I would like to say that it's the same for me. I think there is a meta sort of level discourse here that you may argue that the so-called liberal democracies, or called the West, is under stress because the systems are not really functioning, and that what is happening is precisely what Andrew said, is that one political group now silences another political group. And I think this is a feature or a pattern that we can say it's more or less the liberal or the former liberal sort of parties or progressive parts of the society who try to silence other parts of the societies that have on different topics different opinion. So it comes down to a theorem where the liberal world, the so-called liberal world, is basically silencing the populist sort of part of the world. And this is precisely what Sheldon Wallin, even a couple of years ago, called inverted totalitarianism. So we have to cope with an extremized middle, which once upon a time was a liberal sort of progressive bubble, but which is now silencing the political opponent. And this is precisely what Yanis Varoufakis sketched out in his book, Tech Feudalism, because the instruments of this silencing most of the time come through the new digital world and comes through the internet. And I'm saying this because, in a way, it reflects my own life. Because many of the foundations and NGOs which are basically enumerated in this report, for instance, the DGAP, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik, the German Marshall Fund, the ECFR, European Council on Foreign Relations, I worked for them. I worked for them before I was fired, actually, in 2013. So what I want to report is from own knowledge of these institutions that the inner dynamics of these NGOs described in the report were different in the time. I would say that the density of penetration, of the homogenization of opinions or positions, was not as strong by then, so in the first decade of the 21st century, as outlined in the report. But clearly all these institutions positioned in the so-called European transatlantic consensus of the liberal West. In my experience, working experience, again, I worked in the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik 2000 to 2003, in the German Marshall Fund 2004 to 2007, and in the ECFR 2007 to 2013, I think it's important to note that critiques of that consensus, of the European transatlantic liberal West consensus, was allowed to some extent. You could, in articles, papers, or studies, criticize the government, criticize the governance structures of the EU, of the euro, criticize the EU's austerity policy after the banking crisis, criticize NATO, or the political implications of, say, the US policies in Maidan in 2014. And I would like to say that something slowly and invisibly must have changed, and this comes basically cuts across with what Andrew has been presenting. Something must have changed around 2011, 2014, roughly at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, so that we come now to this censorship network that we see here and that Andrew has described to us. I would like to stretch three arguments how the change could occur. One is certainly that the iPhone, everything in one bullet, appeared, Internet 2.0, more professional funding structures of NGOs, more foundations. Yeah, the German foundation law was boosted since 2008, following ever more companies, Telekom, Mercator, Bosch Foundation, like outlined in this report, were launched. The third aspect is that it can be shown through discourse analysis that when it comes to now the narrative on the Ukraine-Russian war, that the framing of the image of Russia changed with the help of PR agencies roughly since 2007, since Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference. By the way, I was present in Munich when that happened. And if you were in the room, Bayerischer Hof, and then you saw the speech, and then you read the Süddeutsche Zeitung the next day, you could really question whether you have been at the same sort of event. Yeah. What I can basically testimony of is that as I worked for the German Marshall Fund in the years 2004, 5, 6, 7, we did something that we called transatlantic trends, which was polling of sympathies of German citizens towards other countries, like how much the Germans like the US or like the UK, like the French, like the Spanish, and so on and so forth. And the data of 2003, 4, 5 show very precisely that German citizens had a 50-50 sort of positive judgment towards US citizens and Russian citizens. Basically 50% sympathy points Germany to US and 50% sympathy points Germans to Russians. Yeah. So it was not this sort of Russia is a danger and Putin is Hitler sort of thing. And it's very important that we can show today through empirical research that there was a rather positive image of Russia, say 15 years ago. And that is precisely what the report states in a way, because the report starts with control and surveillance features of non-Atlanticist positions moving out of the EU, NATO, OECD, WHO consensus. This is precisely what Noam Chomsky called already in his book of 1988, Manufacturing Consent. The NGO censorship network described in the report is the toolbox for the consent fabrication. It happens in a very subtle, invisible manner by discourse coalitions and subtle pressure of conformity. The Spanish philosopher Marina Garcés calls it the neutralization of critique in her book of 2016. And it was rather interesting for me to see in the report that all the data, how the money basically is exceeding in the spending starts roughly 2016. That's also what you mentioned, Trump, Brexit. Obviously a moment in time where the, say, Western elites have been totally stressed by the populist impulse, Brexit and Trump. And then the funding for defend democracy, defend against the right, basically was increased. And you can see this in the data of these report. So what I want to say, talking about this censorship network today, is that my first observation is that we need to go back roughly a decade to detect the origins and the origins of, I would call it, a hijacking of the NGO system, roughly a decade ago. I think I can say this also because I was dismissed by the ECFR in July 2013. One of the NGOs mentioned in this report, after having written some critical, and I was many times in the news and in speaking to in TV, after some very critical articles pointing to the increased interferences of US policy into European affairs. And this is precisely what I experienced. And here I relate my sort of personal experience to the report, is when in the report there's written that Wolfgang Streeck, a very renowned political scientist, and the article is quoted on page 14, footnote number 19 in the report, taking back control, states and state systems after globalism. And I quote Wolfgang Streeck, along with institutional anchors such as NATO and the EU, whose mechanisms of influence guarantee straightforward economic and security dependence, transatlantic think tanks like the Atlantic Council are key to the German censorship complex. So the Atlantic Council, if you had a working experience like me, who in the first decade was in all these institutions, it's precisely what Andrew says. All these people meet all the time in, be it Brussels or be it Washington or be it Berlin or Barcelona. This is a sort of hub with a very dense personal relations one to the other and amalgamating all these NGOs, DGAP, German Marshall Fund, ECFR. So what I experienced is that there is an American slogan, which I often came across: Europeans invest in institutions, Americans invest in people. So if we discuss censorship networks, then we need to understand that, and I'm here to talk about the societal and the political consequences of this report, that we don't talk about classical forms of censorship, which is forbidding opinion, but what we talk more about is a people's network of people that share all the same opinion, and they do so sort of intrinsically. And they learn to not put into question or to question the assumptions of what they say. So we are talking about a personal network of political, academic, and intellectual elites that constitutes, in the sense of Wolfgang Streeck's finding, what is called in political science a discourse coalition, forging, containing, and repeating the ever-same narratives. The discourse coalition, here the Atlanticist discourse coalition, has a huge political impact on politics and on politics and policies through direct access to government officials, parties, and deputies. As Wolfgang Streeck describes, this transforms the definition of democracy from an essentially plebeian institution into moral attitude, a moral obligation to stick to an Atlanticist position. This obviously, and I think this is what the report is also showing, this obviously increases in times of war, as the report says, and as we can see in the data. War against citizens on COVID, war against, Ukraine, and then Gaza 2020, 22, 23. War times and war preparation need the homogenization of public opinion in order to mobilize and to make societies accept things that they would not accept under normal conditions. Going to war, spending money, inflation, calling for soldiers, training young men, etc., etc. So one of the political and societal findings of this report is certainly that the Atlanticist censorship complex in Germany amplified since the Ukrainian war started in February 2022 and Gaza on 7th of October 23, when, as the report states, morality is the security guaranteed by advanced preparation for a hybrid warfare regime that collapses the distinction between military and civilian spheres and combining efforts to influence and manipulate information with the familiar repressive operations undertaken by the state. In other words, the Atlanticist foreign policy agenda, one may add the Zionist foreign policy agenda, becomes a moral imperative. And that is what we could observe in Germany with this manufactured consensus in the broader geostrategic and geoeconomic sense. And that in a moment of time where the question is that what is the European interest? Because we are sitting here in the European Parliament, we are presenting this report. And so the European interest at a moment in time when obviously the Pax Americana is shifting towards a more multipolar world, the question for Europe reading this report is now, is this in the European, is the control or this the manufactured consent that is manufactured in the way I tried to describe, is this in the geostrategic and in the geoeconomic interest of Europe? My answer is no. So the question is, can Europe tolerate, can the EU tolerate a manufactured consent which might be in contradiction to its own strategic and geopolitical interests? Today, Aya Velázquez has also pointed out a lot of examples, and I won't go into details here. There are ample examples in Germany that Europe banned or shitstormed or a Russian puppet or humiliated or sanctioned when you call for peace, when you call for diplomacy with Russia, when you say that the European Union once upon a time wanted to create a peace order with the Russian Federation, or you demonstrated against the genocide in Gaza, and so on and so forth. Francesca Albanese apparently is also now in the European Parliament. She could not talk in the Freie Universität Berlin, she could not talk at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. So we had a pianist in Berlin who sang peace songs and was arrested, briefly accused of treason. So there are very, very, very serious affection to protest in terms of peace, promoting peace. And I, as the founder of the European Peace Project, I can amply testify on this. So we also have now in books written about this, and this is very good, I think, because in Germany, I think the discussion is sort of waking up. For instance, Jonas Tögel, a young researcher and researcher on propaganda, has detailed in 2 books, NATO Cyber War Propaganda and its techniques. Yeah, okay, so no, I'm finished in a way, and the only thing perhaps in the last minute to bring down the report to a personal sort of experience, I was basically dismissed from my university in February 23 after I had written 2 critical books, one critic on the corona measures in March 22, and the other critical of the Ukraine-Russian war, in which I detailed basically the historical context of this war. And I talked about what today everybody can say. Today, proxy war is the wording. And just to one precise detail, which I think is important to look at this dismissal from the university with what the report is laying out. In the report is mentioned on page 43, the liber-net, which is one of these think tanks. And the liber-net had a project called Gegneranalyse zur Überwachung systemoppositioneller Medien. So they founded, they wrote a report about the surveillance of dissidents, system dissidents. And this was financed by the Ministry for Family and Education, up to 700,000 euros. So what I want to say is that the author of this Gegneranalyse, Markus Linden, is the same man who wrote the article in FAZ in which I was accused allegedly of plagiarism. So I think you can, in the way of the chronological sort of way, and also in the personal relations, you can see a relation between liber-net, financed of the government, being in this report as one of the instruments of the toolbox for sanctioning critical opinion, and then down to the persons who are writing Gegneranalyse, to the person who wrote the article of plagiarism on me, that there is obviously, or not obviously, but there is a suggestion that it might be, a sanctioning which could reach into universities and which could basically sanction and organize dismissals from universities. I like to end up with saying I'm not the only one. There are other professors that have been that came into the cursor, if I may say so. Yeah, for instance, Johannes Warwick of University of Halle, who is also a very critical professor, Stefan Lust, University Bremen. And you can see that there is silencing and there is intimidation of these professors if they dare to move out of a certain consensus. And I would agree with Aya Velázquez that in Europe, which is always proud of enlightenment, of Rousseau, of Voltaire, of the humanism of Kant and eternal peace, this should not be allowed in the realm of what we understand that Europe is good for. Thank you so much.
Thank you.